And today Bud Booth and I are going to take over the next step show and talk about the IRS and us, tax adventures, tax policy, the history of the IRS, and maybe talk about some of the controversies that have been following the IRS around in the last few months, and whether these are legitimate issues or red herrings trying to accomplish another task. Most people, I think, are aware that the IRS was created back in the Civil War, not the IRS, I'm sorry, the income tax that the IRS administers, was created back in the Civil War era as a way of raising funds for the North in the war against the South in the secessionist times, and that it existed for a good many years off and on until the 1890s, 1900s, against rather difficult political and other challenges, but also as a more equitable form of taxation than the other alternatives that were then present. In the early days of our country, most of the revenue of the federal government came from excise taxes and import duties, other fares that were harder to collect and not as clearly equitable. After the first Civil War tax was enacted, there was also a progressive element involved within a couple of years. They actually started taxing wealthy people at a higher rate than poorer people. And of course, there was a very huge exemption at the bottom of the first taxes for people with modest income. I think the first income tax only affected people with income over $600, $800 a year, which would be equivalent to about $20,000 a year by today's standards. So from the beginning, the income tax was a progressive burden. It was challenged, and eventually the Supreme Court threw it out. And then in the early 1900s, we passed the constitutional amendment as a progressive measure. At the time of the late 1890s, 1900s, the labor movement and other movements were engaged in a good many progressive reforms in America, including direct election of senators and a few other things. And so from then on, we have constitutional provision, 16th Amendment, for the use of personal income taxes by the federal government to support its business. And and people complain today about the income tax being unfair in terms of being excessive burden on businesses or corporations or private wealthy individuals, but it's been worse. Certainly at times in World War I, the tax rate was on the wealthiest people was 70-some% on their incremental income above a certain amount. So the idea of a progressive income tax is nothing that just came out in the last 5 years or 20 years, as some of the Tea Party or conservative Republican agenda might make us think. My question is, why is it so easy? Why are we so interested in American domestic politics to criticize a form of taxation which seems on its face to be the most equitable and fair? Is it because it's become unduly complex, which it has? Or is it because the people who have money who don't want it taxed, which I think might be part of it? Bud, you pay taxes?
Well, back at the beginning of our country, even well before that, each individual was more or less their own empire, if I could use that term. And so they grew their own food, they built their own houses, they did everything, and the roads and other things that were necessary for the common good were very, very small and minor. But that's not the case today. Today, the general welfare is necessary to have the government, be it federal, state, or local, to take over these functions of the necessities for doing these various things for the good of the whole community. So there's a requirement for taxing, and the question always comes down to what's the fairest way to tax. And I think Glenn pointed out that the income tax, if it's done progressively, is one of the fairest and easily collected means of taxation.
And yet we are going into a modern version of a progressive tax in which, in fact, the tax burden on the poorest people in the country as a percentage of income is greater than the tax on the wealthy. I had some numbers here somewhere. I think I'll find them, but basically, a medium worker pays a effective income tax rate of about 23.5% of their income on taxes, middle class worker, whereas the richest people pay an average about 18.8%. So even though we claim that we have a progressive tax, we don't. We have a regressive tax which is hitting the middle class the hardest, and that's intentional. The lobbyists and others have succeeded in doing this. And if you add into our tax system the fact that we pay sales taxes and other forms of taxes, property tax, sales tax, car tax, all these other taxes that people pay, the actual burden on the middle class is substantially greater than on the wealthy. The bottom 20% of the people in this country pay 13% of their income on taxes in total, whereas the top 1% pay less than 8% of their income on taxes in total. So we have created, through propaganda and other information, a lot of misunderstanding about the tax system in America. And I'm not sure how we get back out about that. And I think, for example, that this current kerfuffle over the issue about nonprofits claiming tax status and being allegedly targeted is just another example of the attempt, not so much upon that issue, the freedom of speech or all those other issues. It's an attempt upon the very basic right and institution of taxing wealthy people in America.
It should be pointed out that back when 501c4 was initiated, it was, get this word now, exclusively for social welfare. Exclusively for social welfare. Then, for some reason, our leaders have not explored this, that was changed to read primarily for social welfare, which allowed these political entities to get into 501c4. And they have, in spades, I guess I could say, and they're doing it because their donations are not divulged. So we don't know who gives these huge organizations that are chartered under 501c4.
Yeah, I think we need to get back up on that and be clear what you're saying, because I understand what you're saying. I want to make sure that anybody who's watching also understands it. The problem, if we're just going to focus on this current IRS alleged scandal, is that that the IRS is required to judge the appropriateness of any institutional application for tax-exempt status. It's not trying to stop them from existing. It's just saying you can't, if you want to have tax-exempt status so that so people can contribute to you without having to pay taxes and write that off their taxes, then you need to be able to show that you qualify as a 401(c). And as Bud points out, when that 401(c), in fact, if you look at the legislation in the code, the tax code, that is only for organizations that are exclusively, operative word, exclusively engaged in social good programs. In 1959, I mean ages ago, in the Eisenhower administration, at the end of the Eisenhower administration, they issued regulations and revised the definition of exclusive to say that exclusive would henceforth mean that you are primarily engaged in these socially good activities, social welfare activities. And then they went further and said that means that if you're 51% engaged or 50.1% engaged in these activities, you can use the other 49% of your money for political purposes or any other purpose which would not normally be allowed. So, this is not a surprise that there was a burden on the IRS to try to have to enforce a rule that was almost impossible to enforce, and certainly almost impossible to enforce without conflict and controversy.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're gonna study any organization the NRA or the ACLU or any group that has a 401(c) status. And by the way, the ACLU has two, one 401(c) and one not. But you're going to have controversy about the IRS being involved in that. The question is, why was the IRS even asked to do this? And then on top of that is what they had 200 employees assigned to do 70,000 applications a year.
Impossible, just
Totally
impossible.
impossible. So mostly I think it's just they went looking for a fight and found this one, and it's very irritating because in the last 10 years, last 2 years, the IRS has had its employment staff reduced by 10,000 employees. So it's so I'm going back. I think there's more to it here, but I think there's an attempt to continue to protect the wealthiest people in this country from paying a burden that they historically have paid, also to exempt them from corporations from paying a burden that they have historically carried without complaint. America has one of the lowest effective tax rates on corporations in the world.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, Glenn, that our corporate tax rate, and yet the corporations are complaining that they're taxed too high, and yet ours is one of the lowest of the first world countries for corporate taxing.
And the reason it's low is because they have exemptions galore.
Yeah.
And again, it's that complex tax code. So one of the things we might get time to talk about today is suggested remedies to make the tax code work better than it does now. But clearly the person who has the lobbyist in Washington is going to be the wealthy people, the wealthy corporations and the wealthiest people. And they're the ones who are going to have access to Congress and to the regulator, the people who write the regulations and the interpretations. And this thing has been distorted, this thing being the tax code, is being distorted so strongly toward the interests of the wealthy people that it isn't, what's ironic is that like we say, corporates pay almost the lowest effective tax rate in America. I think over half the corporations in America that made profits last year didn't pay any taxes at all.
Thinking of General Electric, they actually, the IRS ended up giving them money back.
But as a propaganda matter, they point out to the 35% number, which is the allegedly corporate tax rate. And they say, oh, that's higher than everybody else. But nobody pays it. So they've got the best of both worlds for their propaganda purposes.
Yeah.
They're paying up very little, but they're claiming that they're being excessively burdened. So we need to think about some choices.
And they're able to sell this to the American public, and sadly enough, if people don't read anything beyond the newspapers and the television and the radio, they get this belief that that's a fact, that the corporations are not taxed as high as they are in other countries.
Here's some statistics just to bolster that. I wish we had a way of showing these graphs. But in 1955, the effective federal tax rate on corporations was 51.2% for corporations. 51.2%. Back in the 50s, back in the conservative 50s, with Dwight Eisenhower as president, and the Congress in the Republican hands, and everybody was happy with America. It was the prosperity point of America, the thing we all aspire to on television. Whereas the effective tax rate for ordinary people was 7.4% for real people, not corporate people. Today, in 2007, the latest number I have, it has gone down in 61 to 42.4 for corporations, 29.9 for corporations in 95, 24.2 for corporations in 97, 2003 it was 19.9 for corporations, and in 2007, 16.6% is the effective tax rate on corporations in America, again, one of the lowest in the world. At the same time, the effective tax rate on individuals has gone from 7.4% in that period of time to 13.6%. So corporations and people are paying almost effective the same effective tax rate. And I remind you that the effective tax rate on the middle class is essentially higher than it is on the wealthiest people with the most income, essentially the wealthiest people in the United States. So how does this happen? It happens because of exemptions, tax dodges, and some things that we all sort of hold sacred, like the home interest tax exemption.
Yeah. Yeah.
And other things. and then we had to look at those exemptions. So, one of the things is it realistic to think as progressives and liberals that some form of tax reform that simplifies the code to a point where we get rid of some of these ideas that we have sort of held highly, like free treatment of employer contributions to your health care. That goes untaxed in America. Mortgage interest expense goes untaxed in America. And are some of these things maybe are we being tricked again as progressives and people concerned about the poor and the middle class?
Yeah. During the election campaign, it came out that Romney was paying about 13.9% of his income in taxes. Now that's even less than what the capital gains taxes is, 15%. And in my mind, there is no reason why capital gains, which is money made from money, should not be taxed at the same rate as money that people get for their mental or physical hard work.
Absolutely.
And how in the world, well, we both know how it happened because, as Glenn pointed out, the lobbyists are there in front of Congress and they get these changes made, such as the capital gains and these other means of getting out of paying a high tax, such as Governor Romney did, ending up with a 13.9% tax rate on his huge wealth.
Right, and this is one of my complaints about the Obama tax policy. President Obama, in a administration surrounded by people from the same financial institutions that brought this disaster about,
Interesting point.
has continued to protect the right of the wealthiest among us to get favored tax treatment on on income they earn in investments, which there is called carried interest and other ideas, so that a person who works in a bank or a financial institution on Wall Street and makes $100 million a year pays maybe 15% or 13.6% after various deductions and whatnot on the income that they make in that job, whereas the guy that's working in the factory down the street here is paying 25-30% on incremental income, and maybe an average of 15 to 20%, as we point out, actually paying a higher rate of income as a percentage of income on taxes than the wealthy people. And so the wealthy get huge tax benefits and huge tax treatments, whereas ordinary people don't.
Yeah.
It costs us all as citizens a huge amount of money for some of this favored tax treatment, and yet we can't seem to break through the propaganda wall. We can't seem to make people understand that there's nothing wrong with rich people paying a fair share of taxes. I remember during the Reagan years, I was stunned by watching these Reagan Democrats, they called them, who switched sides and started voting along with Ronald Reagan and Ronald Reagan policies, which favored the wealthy over their own interests. These are middle-class working people.
That always bothered me too. Why people continue to vote for Congress people and for the president when they very clearly are against their interest to vote for them, but yet they still do.
Well, my analysis of it at the end was that I think these folks had this sort of fantasy. They had been convinced that they would reach that level of wealth.
Yeah.
They would become affluent people. So they started identifying with goals to be achieved, not yet accomplished, but goals. So they actually, this is the American dream idea that somehow.
I guess that's it. That people say, if I work hard and use my brain effectively, someday I will be up there with those $100 million a year people. In
an American economy in which poverty is increasing, the middle class is going backwards, and people are failing to and as I say, all the new wealth is going to the top 1%. People need to understand that their best interests are, I know there's a certain lack of willingness in America to say, I'm a working person. I am not going to be the millionaire. I'm not going to have my own franchise. I'm not going to, be this. I need to look out for my interests as a working person. And that might mean simply protecting my right to have vacation time or sick leave time or take maternity time or, paternity time. Or it might be my prize for labor. And we need to get them back on that track. They need to pay. I don't know how you do it. If you can't make them identify with their own self-interest, it's sort of frustrating. So anyway, some of the things I would like to see done in America that I think could should address some of these failures. Number one is get rid of these things like capital gains tax increase. There's no reason why capital gains should be taxed so lightly, or carried interest should be taxed so lightly. Right. And number one, and I think we probably should be thinking about other forms of ways to raise money in America, and some would be like eliminating some of the programs. I know you're interested in this. The war on drugs costs conservatively estimated $55 billion a year, state and federal, to enforce. And then on top of that, you could gain maybe 30 or 40 billion a year in taxation if some of the recreational drugs were allowed, like they are in Washington and Colorado. And
that's something that's worth discussing a little deeper, which we will
on another show
in future programs.
So, what other program can you imagine that we could do to
Well, a very lucrative means of gaining revenue is taxing Wall Street transactions.
I have that on my list.
Many other countries of the world, first world countries, Germany, Great Britain does, I know, and I believe France does, Germany does. They tax Wall Street, or not Wall Street, but they're comparable to Wall Street transactions. And there's no reason in the world that we can't do that.
European Union, in January of this year, as I recall, started instituting a transaction fee. I think it's 0.1% on bank transactions and 0.01% on brokerage, arbitrage, dividend. What do you call those things that got us in trouble? The really funny ones. And they expect that that's going to generate something like $50 billion a year in tax revenues.
And if you raised it up a little higher in percentage, you could get any amount, and it wouldn't hurt. It wouldn't hurt these people that are making these huge amounts on these Wall Street transactions.
Well, it accomplishes two things. One is it helps them pay back for the damage they cause.
Yeah.
This current economic disaster that we're suffering through 7 years later is totally the result of these speculators. I don't care how you cut it. I don't care what anybody else says. The bottom line is, it was these people who were making unsustainable bets on a house of cards, on a bubble, whatever you want to call it, and grabbed the money and got out and left us all holding the bag that caused it. So there's no reason why they shouldn't be asked to pay a tax, a dinky tax, number one, to help pay for that and avoid it in the future. And number two, it would discourage, if anything, maybe it'll slow them down. We have a situation now where trades occur 40, 50 trades in a second.
Yeah.
This stuff is done
electronic trading, that's
and there's no healthy purpose to that.
No.
There's no economic model that says, you at arm's length trading with me at arm's length and can decide what the value should be when it's happening so fast we couldn't even think that fast. So I think that it's a desirable thing and probably the most important thing. Now, it's been proposed in the United States Senate by a few, I think Bernie Sanders for one, but you can imagine how far that gets, especially considering the people who are in charge of the current administration's economic policies and all other potential administrations in the foreseeable future in America. They are not going to let, Goldman Sachs is not going to let this happen in their watch.
Yeah.
And that's sad. That's really sad. So that would be, that definitely would be a good thing to do. And the other thing to do would probably be to consider some type of reform of the corporate tax code. I personally wouldn't mind seeing a lowered corporate tax if it was enforced.
Enforced and administered effectively, yes.
And then a simple one would be to get rid of this favored treatment for overseas income.
Oh, yes, that's a very important one. And that's something that could be a program all in itself, is these hiding the money overseas. And
Well, it's not difficult. I mean, it always sounds sort of fancy, but what they do, a company that's making shoes, let's say, makes the shoes in China, and then but sells the patent rights and the royalty rights to that shoe brand to some other corporation that is offshored in New Guinea or some favored state with a low corporate tax, Ireland. And that corporation then is assigned, that is given the shoes they make in China for X dollars. So when those shoes are then sold in the United States, the profit in the United States, because they say they pay $20 for the shoes in Guam. Mm-hmm. They make them for $2 in China. They buy them for $20 in Guam. That's an $18 difference. They sell them for $22 in the United States. Only the $2 profit is reported in the United States.
yeah,
The $18 profit is kept offshore.
yeah.
So that's how that works. It's not that hard to figure out, and it wouldn't be that hard to stop. But we need to stop. But everybody knows it's happening, and in fact, we have special laws that encourage it to happen, mm-hmm. and those things need to be changed. That would be a benefit.
I'm thinking of another is a depletion allowance for the extraction of oil and other minerals from the ground, and because when they're gone, when the oil is burned up in the automobiles and our energy producers, it's gone.
That's right.
And there's no reason why that should not be taxed as the depletion of the natural resources.
It belongs to all of us. It belongs to the individuals. It doesn't, this idea that somehow somebody bought this lease and therefore they have a limited resource that can never be replaced for their personal goal when they never even knew it was there sometimes, mm-hmm. And didn't do a thing to accomplish it, mm-hmm. other than drill it out. Those things need to be addressed. And California, as you know, had a chance to vote for an extraction tax 2 years ago, I think it was. And the oil companies and the others convinced them not to do this, that we would somehow see higher gas prices, which is absurd. I mean, Alaska has an extraction tax. Texas has an extraction tax. Both conservative states, and they're not going broke.
Yeah.
But how come? So again, this is the frustration of trying to get information out and into the public. Well, this is a complex subject. Money is always complex, and how people address money is always complex. So maybe we'll have to talk about it again another time. And we're about ready to get off the air. So I want to thank Ali Adachek and Juanita Chatham and Liz Burke, who are working back in the studio and pushing those buttons. And Bud, thanks for letting me be on the show.
Thank you.